the arts in response to the Tridentine reform, and it's kind of in two parts, but they sort of move from one to the other, the Church Militant and the Church Triumphant. So let's have a look at the first image. So here we have the Triumph of the Cross from 1585, and this is a ceiling fresco in the Sala di Costantino in the Vatican. And it was commissioned by Pope Gregory XIII, and we'll hear his name quite often. He crops up as one of the post-Trent Tridentine popes who most fervently put into practice the decrees of the council, obviously primarily on theological and liturgical matters, but also on artistic matters. And he was a great patron of the arts. And so, in a sense, this image sums up the message of Trent and the message of the triumph of the cross. We have a classical architectural setting and an altar, as in the pagan sacrificial altar standing outside the actual Holy of Holies of a pagan temple. That altar would have had on it a statue of Mercury, and so we can see that the statue has been smashed and is on the ground, and in its place is the cross. And so this is a symbol, really, of everything that the council had to say in regard not only to the challenge of paganism, but of course we're not dealing with paganism in the 16th century, we're dealing with the whole challenge that was provided by the Protestant Revolution. So before we begin to look at the arts in response to Trent per se, we need to look a little bit at what was going on in the arts in response to the Protestant Revolution. And I call it revolution because it really was a turning upside down, a complete change. So here we have, as an example, the magnificent Four Apostles from 1526 of Albrecht Dürer. And Peter, Paul, on the right in white, and Mark and John are depicted in these two panels, which, because of the situation in the Protestant church, there was no relationship between the patron and the artist that had so long existed in the Catholic Church, where the patron, the Pope, the Cardinal, a prince, would commission a work of art from the artist. This would all change because the status of the work of art in the Protestant tradition, and of course we're talking about something that's only been in existence for 10 or 15 years by the time that this picture was painted, there was no context for commissioning. So Dürer, who had been a Catholic, but he converted to Protestantism, he painted this picture and gave it to the town council in Nuremberg, and they put it on show in the town hall. So in a sense, it's a big change from the way that art had been done previously, and it's sort of incredibly modern. It's about the status of the artist. Dürer was already famous. He'd come to Italy, he'd been in Venice, he'd been exposed to the Venetian colour, which we can see here in the large example of his work. But the status of the artist was much more proud, much more individual, and this underlined somewhat the Protestant aesthetic, if we can talk about it here. And so here we have a certain directness is visible in the painting. The way that the figures fill the whole of the frame of the painting, they're pushed right up in front of us. There's nothing to distract us from looking at the figures themselves and pondering upon them. So there's a directness and a simplicity which characterizes the approach of the Protestant aesthetic. So here is an example of work by Lucas Cranach. Cranach was the court painter to the Elector of Saxony, and this is one of his several portraits of Martin Luther, the reformer, the Protestant reformer. And as court painter to the Elector of Saxony, Cranach produced many religious works as well as portraits. His religious works tended to focus on the aspects that were the most significant for the Protestant religion at the time, the law and particularly scripture specifically. So again, clarity you can see certainly in the way that this picture is presented, and very much like the Jura, the face of Luther is pushed right up to the front, and there isn't anything around it, such as attributes, such as decoration, such as landscape or interior setting, as we would find in contemporary portraits in the Catholic world. Here's another of Cranach's works. He did several versions of Adam and Eve. And again, we have this filling up the picture space. We have simplicity and clarity. There's a certain sort of sinuous beauty in the depiction of the figures, which is very typical of the North, which we also find actually in Catholic art in the 15th century, in Catholic Netherlandish art. And so Cranach is taking a lot from the tradition, but he's employing it in slightly a different way. So, in terms of the Calvinistic, which developed obviously from the Lutheran, the Calvinistic tendency to iconoclasm, this is something that really needs to be mentioned. There was, particularly in the north of Europe, a very vigorous campaign against images. Iconoclasm is the destruction of images. And although in the history of the church there have been various waves of iconoclasm at certain times, what happened with the Calvinistic iconoclasm is that churches were attacked, images were destroyed. This was the images and the use of images and the consequent devotion to the saints was all swept away with the Protestant Revolution. Now, although Calvin had a huge problem with music, and he certainly didn't want any music in any of his churches, there wasn't an equivalent iconoclasm in a sense, because music is sort of free to move. It doesn't stand still to be broken and smashed. There was, probably stimulated by the Protestant Revolution, a big change in the way that the music moved in the lands which had embraced Protestantism. And we have to bear in mind that musically, the new religion gave birth to new genres and also fostered new genius. I mean, for example, where would we be without Bach? But the situation in the Catholic world, in musical terms, certainly needed reform. And I haven't got time to go into the great complexity of the development of music in medieval Catholic, medieval sacred music, but suffice it to say that the music was getting more and more complicated. There was quite a lot of objection to the fact that secular themes, popular songs, dances, etc. were used and were considered to be suitable as settings for the Mass. And the complexity of harmonies made it sometimes very difficult for people to understand the words. And this was something that was generally felt. The artistry of the musicians, and a lot of them who worked in Italy were Netherlandish musicians who were extremely famous, and the work that they produced was magnificent, but it wasn't quite what was needed at the time. So there was clearly a movement for reform on the musical sense, and we're going to come back to music, of course, in a minute. But looking at Cranach, we should try and see what's happening exactly in the Catholic world in exactly the same year. If I can make it move. Okay. So this amazing image is the Madonna of the Rose by Parmigianino from 1513. And this was painted, and we're talking about commissioning earlier on. This was painted, it was commissioned by a humanist scholar and writer, very famous, whose name is going to come up again in our story this evening, Pietro Aretino. And eventually it was in fact given to the Pope. The Pope arrived in Bologna, and at that point this picture was given to the Pope. And the story, one of the stories about this painting goes that in fact it started life as a Venus and Cupid. And if we look at the picture, we can perhaps be surprised that it represents a Madonna and Child, and perhaps it's more fitting that it should represent Venus and Cupid. Extremely sensual, the nudity, the pose, the way the drapery of the Madonna reveals her breast, etc. There seems to be a lot of iconographical muddle going on here between the sacred and the profane. So in the terms of image, this is something that you can imagine when it came to talking about the reform of the visual arts, that something like this was probably one of the things that people were objecting to. Worth bearing in mind, however, that Cranach also used his Eve to be his Venus. He did pictures of Venus and Cupid, and he used the same female figure for Eve as he did for Venus. So there is a kind of mixing between the two, between the sacred and profane in Cranach as well, but the way that he revealed it is completely different. Okay, so a picture that really requires a whole book to talk about, particularly in the context of reform, is Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, which was commissioned in 1534 and unveiled in 1541. So with those two dates, you have a kind of span of prior to the council, and the council met for 25 sessions between 45 and 63. So it was commissioned by Pope Paul III before the council, and it was unveiled just as the council was getting going, just as the movement for reform was gathering pace. Those dates are significant because they span those years, and it underlines the fact that there were elements in the Catholic Church who were working for a reconciliation with the Protestant theologians on the issue of sola fide at this time, which ultimately failed with the victory of the so-called intransigenti, the intransigents, and the limitation of the reform undertaken to be dealing with abuses. Michelangelo himself and his philosopher friend Vittorio Colonna belonged to the group, one of the groups that was interested in this idea of reconciliation, and also the English Cardinal Pole was also interested in this approach. Pope Paul III had guided the design of the picture, which was a celebration of the glorified body, completely orthodox in theological terms, but when it was unveiled, this picture, the atmosphere in theological circles was very different because of the failure of this idea of reconciliation. Michelangelo had intended the meaning of the nudity to be that we are all exposed at the final judgment, just as we were when we were born, both physically and existentially. And the figure of the young Christ, and there was a lot of criticism that Christ is shown so young here without a beard and so forth, is that he also is reborn in glorified body. But by the time you get to the 1540s, the stress had turned to retribution of the Last Judgment and the need for judgment as a weapon of discipline, and to reassert the role of the Church in repentance. So Pietro Aretino, who we heard of as the commissioner of that Parmigianino Madonna, he was very vocal. He was a very clever person for judging the way that opinion was going, and he was vocal and wrote a letter in 1550 criticizing this work as elitist, in that it appealed to an artistic and intellectual elite and not to the average worshipper, which actually would be absurd because this is in the Pope's private chapel and no average worshipper would have seen it. But nevertheless, because the image was hugely reproduced, if you think of the time that this came out, this painting was unveiled in 1541, which is right at the beginning of the explosion of printing, it was immediately, engravings were made and circulated, and because of Michelangelo's fame, this image, this design, was known all over Europe quite quickly. And so it didn't seem to fit anymore with what was needed. So the fact that it seemed to be sort of undemocratic in theological terms was one of the reasons that people criticised it. And so this Aretino's letter sort of unleashed a sort of wave of tension and criticism against this work. And it's famously resulted in the repainting of the wall, of the surface of the picture, with clothing many of the nude figures, because the nudity was objected to. It was considered to be unseemly to be in the Pope's chapel. Michelangelo died in 1564. And as soon as he was dead, essentially, that's when they started to have a go at the picture to bring it more in line with what was considered to be suitable. So here's very ugly in colour, but you can see the two figures here, St. Catherine of Alexandria and St. Blaise, have both got drapery painted on them. And the person who painted them was actually Michelangelo's pupil, called Daniele di Volterra, and he got the nickname Il Braghettone, somebody who puts pants on people, because that's just precisely what he did in this picture. So there's, obviously you can see what they were getting at, how the mood had changed since the celebration, the glorification of the joy at the Last Judgment, which is what Michelangelo and Pope Paul III had intended. So one of the treatises written after the council, of which there were many on the subject of art, was by Andrea Giglio, and it was a dialogue on the errors and abuses of painters. He quoted the Roman writer Horace on the necessity of a barrier between the sacred and profane in art, that there should be the historical and the poetic, or the imaginative, and that there should be a separation between them. And so it's important to notice that ancient authority is always invoked by people in the 15th and 16th century when they're talking about theory behind art, is to go back to the ancients. So now let's turn to the Council of Trent itself. So this is a painting by an anonymous of the interior of the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Trent. Probably know that Trent is a town in the north of Italy, and that's where the council met for 25 sessions between December 1545 and December 1563. So music specifically was dealt with at the end of the council in 1562 and 3, and also art was dealt with at one of the sessions at that time as well, in session 25. And the art was discussed in the sense of the relics of the saints. The idea of the relics of the saints being a physical remnant of the saints that help us with our devotion to the saints. And that the images of the saints, painted images, sculpted images in churches, again aid us in our devotional purpose. So when the council was discussing art, it was art in connection with relics, which is quite interesting. So now we're going to hear our first piece of music, which is a wonderful setting by a Netherlandish composer called Johannes de Clare. And basically he set some prayers, 10 prayers called the Portraiture Speciales, the special prayers, that had been written for the council itself. And it was the Cardinal of Augsburg, I think. Yes, the Cardinal of Augsburg who commissioned de Keller to write the musical setting. And the prayers had been written by a Dominican theologian, and they were essentially prayers for the council, for the union of Christian people, for the remission of error, against the fury of the church's enemies. So de Keller composed in a blend between the Italian style and a Flemish counterpoint. And again, he used different tones in the music in order to invoke certain aspects of character that he wanted the music to represent. The Phrygian mode representing repentance, etc. So again, he was looking back to the ancient traditions of musical theory. So we're going to hear part of the first prayer of the Portraiture Speciales, and I'm going to just read you the text of it, or part of the text, which is, I'm going to read it in Latin. I mean, kind of work out what it says. Suscipiant Domine, montes ecclesia tua, pastores et doctores nostri, pacem populum tuo, et coles isti justitiam. Salvos fac eos filios pauperem apostolorum tuum, et humilia calumniatorum hereticum, etc. Okay, so that's a very short excerpt of the beginning of the first of these 10 prayers. And musicologists have written about this and have explained to us that while the council was in session, this set of prayers was sung 3 times a week and was received with great enthusiasm by the cardinals and the bishops at the council. And it's magnificent to think about a piece of music of that quality being performed while the council was meeting. Okay, so to move now a little bit to Rome, to think about things at St. Peter's. So here we have, on the right, obviously, the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, and on the left is the drawing by Michelangelo of one of his projected plans for the dome. And I wanted to speak a little bit now about the architectural styles and the moment that we are in architecture, which is considered to be Mannerist, the idea of the classical forms of the Renaissance being altered and exaggerated to a certain extent to express something. Now, people often say that the Last Judgment is an expression of anxiety and tension as a result of the sack of Rome, which took place in 1527. I don't know whether you can read that sort of anxiety into forms, but there's certainly truth in that the drum of St. Peter's is taking the classical forms and exaggerating them, moulding them. In a sense, Michelangelo is creating a sort of wall surface that ripples and moves and is almost constantly in motion. And this has something to do with the spirit that he wanted to imbue into the form of the architecture. Now, originally, with Bramante's plan for St. Peter's and also with Michelangelo, the idea was a dome in the centre of the church, and it was going to be a Greek cross plan. And this gave way eventually to the Latin cross that we know now as being the plan of St. Peter's under the architect Carlo Moderno at the beginning of the 17th century. This was considered to be a symbolic representation, as we had obviously with the Triumph of the Cross beforehand, the idea of the cross representing a more true symbol of all of Christianity, whereas the Greek cross would have been not so suitable for that role. So this is actually an interesting image, which I just found recently, shows the combination between old St. Peter's and the creation of the new basilica, which is rising behind it. This is an engraving from 1575 to celebrate a jubilee of the church that was taking place at that time. And we have here in the centre the arrival of the Pope, Pope Gregory XIII, that I mentioned before. He's arriving in, notice St. Peter's Square isn't there because it wasn't there until later with Bernini. So he's arriving at the front of the basilica, and it's very helpfully labelled for us the portico of Constantine. There's the old church, and then rising behind it you can see the dome of St. Peter's itself. So all of this building was going on, all of this, the translation of relics, the carrying of relics from the old church into the old basilica, into the new basilica, all of this was happening at the time in the 16th century, 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century. It wasn't like a moment where old St. Peter's sort of was knocked down and new St. Peter's took over 100 years to build, clearly. So it was a combination of both of those buildings that were in existence together for quite a long time. So Gregory XIII had lots to do, and in response to the council, he created many works of art, commissioned many works of art, as I said. And here we have two images from his own chapel, the Capella Gregoriana, which he created in 1580 to 85. Now, this used to be the Blessed Sacrament Chapel in St. Peter's. It's now the chapel where you go for confession if you want to go for confession in the church. And essentially, it became an artistic focus for Gregory to celebrate one of the great saints with his name, St. Gregory Nazianzen, whose relics were brought to this chapel from a church in Rome with great celebration and brought to be venerated here in this chapel. And the altars that were built nearby were also related to other doctors of the church. So Gregory Nazianzen was a Greek doctor of the church, and so St. Basil, St. Jerome, who's depicted in the altar just on the exterior of the chapel. This is the Mass of St. Jerome by Domenichino. And so essentially what Gregory was doing was creating a link between the two Greek doctors and two Latin doctors, and obviously Pope Gregory the Great. His tomb was also very close by in the Basilica, bringing all the relics together and creating in that chapel a focus for the underlining the doctrine of the doctors of the church, transmitting their wisdom to us and therefore their interpretations of the scriptures and so forth. And there was also a very strong Eucharistic message in this chapel. As I say, it was the Blessed Sacrament Chapel at the time. And as we can see with the Mass of St. Jerome and also the ceiling decoration, the idea of underlining the teaching of transubstantiation and against the Protestant denial of that, and keeping all of that very much into the fore, he lavished an awful lot of care and attention on the design of this chapel. And interestingly is that in the centre of the high altar there, you can't see it very well because it's surrounded by all this marble decoration, but there is a very small ancient icon which he chose to be put in this place. And here we have really the key point we went back to earlier, the idea of relics and icons, going back to bringing the old relics from the old basilica into the new basilica, finding old images. The icon is an old image, the Madonna del Soccorso, the most venerable image of the Virgin within St. Peter's Basilica, and putting it in a new setting. So this was something that was very much in the mood of the council, not neglecting those older pictures, but giving them a new life in the context of the new basilica. So with the two Latin and two Greek fathers, as I mentioned, the program of the chapel, the idea behind the chapel was the universality of the church, the claim to sovereignty and inheritance from the ancient Greeks, thereby replacing philosophy with faith. Okay, so let's just thinking again about this idea of the High Renaissance and the way that things change. Here we have a very famous image of Raphael's, the Madonna of Foligno from 1510, and the gathering of the saints with the Madonna above, as it were, in the sky, is the classical form called the Sacra Conversazione, the holy conversation. This is an idealized devotional image. The blending of zones between supernatural and natural could be considered confusing, or perhaps might consider that beauty dominates over a devotional or didactic aim. And so in a sense, in the High Renaissance, Leonardo and Raphael were making the sacred iconic, turning the sacred into an icon. But it's interesting that in 1565, the year of the death of Michelangelo, the year of the sort of outcry against his last judgment, this picture, which had been on the high altar of the Araceli church in Rome, ever since it had been commissioned, was removed as unsuitable, and it was replaced by an icon, an old painting of the Virgin in the Greek style, which was put in the place of the Raphael. And the same year, it was very significant in music because it marked the year of the trial of the masses, as it's known, and the legend of the Missa Papa Marcelli by Palestrina. This took place at Easter time in 1565, and the papal singers were assembled, I quote, in the house of Cardinal Vitellozzi at his request to sing some masses and to test whether the words could be understood as their eminences desired. So essentially there was probably 6 or 7 mass settings were tried out. De Curler, who we heard, Roussel, Lassus, Animuccia, Palestrina, and maybe Ruffo. So we're going to hear, and matching very well with this very beautiful classical painting, classical High Renaissance painting, is an excerpt from the Missa Marcelli of Palestrina. So the idea is that Palestrina, in a sense, he's also the icon of sacred music of the 16th century. The purity, the clarity, the harmony, the resolution within a most perfect and contained fashion that his mass settings provided and there were many, many of his mass settings, and we're very fortunate at the Oratory because we can hear quite a lot of them on Sunday Mass here. They are a huge influence on later work, but they also, although there isn't actually any truth in the story that this Mass actually saved polyphony in the Church, that wasn't the case, but it certainly responded to some of the needs that the Council Fathers were asking for. So we're going to hear now the Kyrie from Palestrina's Missa Marcelli.
Back to Trent and what was going on at the council.
This is actually contemporary with the piece of music. This is the Doctors of the Church, a commission given to a local artist, Bergamasque artist, Moroni, who was present at the council and was given the commission to paint the altarpiece at Santa Maria Maggiore, where the council was meeting. And here he's underlining the authority of the Doctors of the Church to transmit the scripture to the people. And this was commissioned in 1551. It illustrates, in fact, specifically the second decree of the fourth session in 1546, which adopted the Vulgate as the official translation that underlined the Church as the only interpreter of Scripture. Now, Moroni was a person who was not a particularly well-known artist, and I think now he's more well-known because there's a magnificent exhibition of his painting at the Royal Academy in London. I've been several times to see it. It's on for about another week, and I would certainly recommend that people go and see it. I mean, not only are these very interesting religious pictures, which I'm going to be showing, but some portraits, which are really quite unique. He worked in the north, and so, apart from Rome obviously being a centre where the decrees of the council were pushed out, were promulgated, in the north was very, very important, particularly Milan, because in Milan there was an archbishop, Cardinal Borromeo, now Saint Carlo Borromeo, who, with great enthusiasm and enormous energy, embraced the reforms of the council, and therefore created in the north of Italy, particularly around Milan, where Moroni was working, a very strong atmosphere of reform. He was very zealous for the reform, both liturgically, theologically, but also particularly with music. So here's one of the interesting Moroni religious paintings, and this is a gentleman in contemplation before the Madonna and Child, 1555. Compare it in your mind with the Raphael that we just saw. It's a very different situation. It's probably a donor portrait in the sense that there's the donor man who paid for the picture, probably, and in contemplation of the Virgin. But think also back to the Jura that we saw at the beginning. Moroni has got also the same idea of pushing everything right to the front, the directness of the man who's in prayer in front of the Virgin's image. In a sense, she's present in a small room. He's at the front. There's a distance between him and her. The world of the natural and the supernatural, there's a demarcation. But the fact that we're very close up to him means that we are more directly in contact with the supernatural. So it's a kind of interesting shift in the way that the devotional image was created. A picture by Moroni, which illustrates something of this very similitude and stress on simplicity, simplicity creating dignity, is his portrait of an elderly abbess, a nun in Bergamo, Lucrezia Agliardi, from 1557. Now, Cardinal Gabriel Pagliotti, who wrote a treatise about the council decrees on art, declared that only people, quote, whose moral goodness or Christian saintliness would be an incitement to virtue should be portrayed in art. And this would be obviously a perfect example of that, this venerable lady with also the inscription below in Latin, again adding to the status of the image. But maybe we should actually possibly disagree with the Cardinal on that, because otherwise we wouldn't have works of art such as this, because obviously we have no idea of the moral goodness or Christian saintliness of the Mona Lisa. So Moroni also, with these two images here, the contemplation of baptism and donor before a crucifixion, we have again the same idea of the barrier between the natural and the supernatural, the use of the donor figure or the contemplating figure at the beginning to guide the observer of the work, the audience towards the sacred moment that is taking place, and really quite extraordinary use of this low wall as a barrier between the person and the sacred image, just as the frame of the picture is a barrier between us and the painting itself. So this distance, this contemplation rather than idealism, creates this separation between the sacred and profane. So as in art, so in music, and the reform in Milan under Carlo Borromeo, the archbishop, who became archbishop in 1565, and who declared that music really needed to be reformed quite significantly. And so we're going to hear in a moment a piece by Vincenzo Ruffo, one of the masses that was performed at the trial of the masses that I mentioned in Rome was by Ruffo, and he worked in a variety of styles reflecting the different requirements of the patron. The Council of Trent gave the practice of music a new meaning and deepening of conceptions of the church and worship, and it determined the practice of church music in succeeding ages. And for Carlo Borromeo, he called a provincial council to take place in Milan after the Council of Trent had finished. And the idea of that was to reinforce some of the decrees of the council. And regarding music, he declared that it should be grave and pious and distinct music, appropriate to the house of God and to divine praises, so that simultaneously the words may be understood and the listeners aroused to piety. So we're going to hear now from Ruffo a short piece called Adoramus Te Christi, which was for the Good Friday liturgy. And I don't have a date for this piece of music, but it's clearly post-Tridentine. It's very, very clear, declamatory in style, and it contrasts very well with what we heard before, the Palestrina. So the picture that we're looking at the moment is one of the most extraordinary of the Moroni images. It's his Last Supper, which was painted for a parish church in Romano di Lombardia in 1567. And the point of this of this picture was to underline the presence of God in the Blessed Sacrament. Obviously, one of the key aspects of the decrees of the Council were to be reinforced, directly challenging the Protestant denial of transubstantiation. And extraordinarily, in this image, we have the scene of Christ sitting amongst the apostles at the moment of the Last Supper, and the figure behind him seems to dominate the picture. In fact, is a portrait of the parish priest himself, who is serving at the Last Supper. There couldn't be anything that more clearly underlines the fact that the people in the church who would have had this picture in front of them as they were receiving Holy Communion were actually being brought right into the sacred moment by the participation of their parish priest, right there in the middle of the painting. So Moroni really sort of encapsulates, I think, some of this this response to the idea of democracy, so-called, or directness and simplicity that the Protestant aesthetic, theological aesthetic, was proposing by coming back with a Catholic answer that was very, very valid. Well, moving to works of artists who we would have heard more familiar to us. This is Veronese's painting from 1573. A very famous story regarding this is that when he was commissioned originally to paint a Last Supper, such as the one we've just seen, although he would have done it in a very different way, and he started creating this extraordinary image with many figures, with almost a playful air to it, a very sort of festive moment. Obviously, Veronese is a Venetian painter, so there's an awful lot of colour, there's a lot of light and liveliness in this picture. But the post-Tridentine mood did not suit this for the Last Supper. It seemed almost, perhaps even blasphemous, certainly far too secular an image. And the decrees of the council, insofar as they were enforced, well, it was the Inquisition, which had been refounded recently, was in charge of looking after what people were doing with the decrees of the council. And so they were called Veronese in to talk to them about this painting and explain himself. And it's quite interesting that, obviously, because it was a hearing, his words were recorded, and he said, well, I don't know what you expect. I'm an artist. This is how I express myself, and, I'm really, I've got nothing else to say on the subject. And it seems that the fathers of the Inquisition were extremely understanding of him, and they said, well, look, why don't we just change the title? So it's not a Last Supper, it's the Feast in the House of Levi. So distancing it from the sacred presence of Christ and the apostles gives it acceptability. And so it seems that the Inquisition's interference on that sort of level was very rare. I mean, basically didn't happen very often, but as you can see, they were particularly lenient. So we were talking at the beginning about the kind of moods, the church militant and the church triumphant. And the last section of the talk, I just briefly want to look at some of the images and some of the ways in which the feeling and the atmosphere changed as the century came to the end and the beginning of the 17th century. And we could say that the intense spirituality of the new orders that had been founded at the end of the 16th century underlined both the reform of the council, but also created a new fervor, both artistically and spiritually. So in this engraving, we can see 4 portraits around, and then the interior of St. Peter's, celebrating the canonizations in 1622 by Gregory XV, who was the patron of Bernini, a Jesuit-educated pope, that the canonizations of St. Ignatius, of St. Philip Neri, of St. Teresa of Avila, and St. Isidore Agricola. And obviously, the first 3 that I mentioned are founders of new orders that brought new life to the church and particularly stimulated new commissions in art and in music. So we're looking now at the idea of clarity, legibility, focus on the spiritual message, and this is how art in the beginning of the 17th century, both in Italy and elsewhere, was growing stronger in that department. So here I just wanted to bring in a little, going back to the Venetian idea. Greco, of course, was Greek, as his name suggests, and he lived in Spain, as his name also suggests, and he did most of his work in Spain, but he was trained in Venice. He started as an icon painter. He went to Venice, and you can see in his the intense coloration here that he has taken a lot from the Venetian tradition. But there's something very, very new, very edgy, very intense about the way that he expresses this in this work, which is obviously the Agony in the Garden, and it's a very dramatic. He's included a landscape background, so there's some sort of narrative, but again the figures are right in the foreground, and there's no missing the drama and intensity of the moment. In a sense, with El Greco, we're kind of the epitome of the intensity of Counter-Reformation art. And I'd like to quote from Francesco Pacheco, who was a theorist and artist in Spain, who had studied El Greco's work and ended up being father-in-law to Velázquez, on the subject of the role of the Catholic painter. He said that we can say that painting, which before had this imitation as its sole aim, now, as an active virtue, takes on new and rich trappings. It elevates itself to a supreme end, the contemplation of eternal glory. So there's very, very much the atmosphere there of the status of painting having been raised up to something much more direct and much more worthy. So at the beginning of the 17th century in Rome, we have a very important development in the history of art, which is essentially the naturalism that was characterized northern painting being brought into the fore by masters such as Caravaggio. And here we have Caravaggio's St. Peter and St. Paul in the the Cherazi Chapel at Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome, both from 1600. And in many ways, these are obviously revolutionary images. Again, we have the people, the action is pushed right to the front of the picture plane. We have dramatic lighting, which is something that he took from the north. We have directness in that the very banal setting in which these sacred moments are taking place is brought to the fore. You know, the horse's rump is shown right at the front, and this man who's hauling the cross up again is kneeling down. It's almost undignified. Well, it's certainly undignified, but it kind of underlines the direct reality there of the spiritual message. These are things that actually happened in history with real people, and people with dirty bare feet, and you know, hauling on the rope to pull up the cross and so forth. So it's a really key moment in a kind of expressivity and power, and at the same time as this naturalistic tendency with Caravaggio, we have the classicizing tendency, which is represented by the painting on the left here, which is the Assumption. This is actually the painting central in that chapel to those two Caravaggios on either side, and they were commissioned by the same person, and they were painted in the same year. But it's a completely different strand of art existing in Rome, much more dependent on Raphael for form and for colour, but nevertheless the sort of Bolognese classicism, because the Carracci painting, the Carracci family of artists were from Bologna, coexisted very happily with this naturalistic tendency with Caravaggio. And on the right-hand side of the screen here, we've got his burial, which was made for the Chiesa Nuova, for the Oratorian Church in Rome, at the same date, 1601. So despite the innovatory manner, this was in tune very much with the Oratorian spirit of reliving spiritual experiences through prayer. The directness of the image, again, there's quite a depth to Raphael, also in Caravaggio, in terms of his grouping of the figures. But again, the reality, the corporeal reality, the bodiliness of the work is very dramatically expressed. Now, I mentioned Bernini, and we can't go anywhere really at this point without touching on Bernini. And here is his Ecstasy of St. Teresa sculpture in the Cornaro Chapel of Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome, which was completed, the whole chapel completed in 1652. So St. Teresa of Avila, one of the new saints, the founders of the new orders, which had given new life in many ways to the church at this time. And with this picture we have accuracy, fidelity to the text, in that he's depicting what St. Teresa wrote herself about the ecstasy and how it happened to her. And he's depicting it again, like Caravaggio, with this very strong bodily aspect is being underlined. You know, the way that she is being transported by her vision, and the love of God being represented by the spear that the angel is holding, and she has lost herself in the vision. Her hand droops to one side, her foot drops down. Bernini is a master of creating an effect, and the way that the people have been to that chapel, perhaps some of you have, the tiny little window that you can't see that throws light directly down onto the sculpture. he uses light and he uses drama as a way of adding an extra dimension to the sacred image. There's a lot that one could say about it, and this is the chapel as a whole, and the drama aspect is underlined with Bernini, as it is with other artists, but this was massively influential, is that on either side of the chapel, those donors that we've seen in the Moronis and also in the Raphael, the people who paid for the picture, in this case the people who paid for the chapel, are represented as viewing the scene from behind the balconies, as if they were at the opera, looking at seeing this sacred moment taking place in front of them. So they are recorded as being participatory in the spiritual moment, and at the same time, so therefore it becomes a portrait of them, and so brings them into the realm of the sacred, and we, as we enter the chapel, are also brought into this conversation, but it's all in a very new way. So, to finish now this sort of quick look at the art in response to the Tridentine reform, I want to just look at Baroque art in the German lands here in Salzburg, and I'm just going to hope to goodness that the thing works. Okay, so I want to tell you about a piece of music written by Biber, Heinrich Ignaz Franz Biber, and his Rosary sonatas, which were composed around 1670. So here we have a connection in this particular, with this particular piece of music with art and with devotion. And here we've got it's a modern view, obviously, because they put seats in front, but this is what's called the Aula Academica, the hall, academic hall of the University of Salzburg, and from 1619. And the person who commissioned this piece of music, which, if all goes well, we're going to hear a bit of because I've got it on my computer, promoter, his name was Maximilian Gandolf, and he was promoter of the local confraternity of the Rosary. So this was lay people gathering together to say the Rosary, which devotion was being proposed in a more lively fashion, particularly as a result of Jesuit education throughout Europe at the time. And he was in charge of the Rosary Confraternity. He commissioned these works of art inside the academic hall of the University at Salzburg, and all of these pictures are the mysteries of the Rosary. And Biber was commissioned by Gandolf to create a cycle of pieces for the violin, solo violin, or with a group of other stringed instruments, each one representing one of the mysteries of the Rosary. And it seems that the way it works is that people would gather, and they would gather in this hall, and they would say the Rosary in front of each of the images, and as they moved from one image to the other, the music would be played. So the music also represents, in a devotional sense, the mysteries of the Rosary, and the paintings, which are not of very good quality, but nevertheless they are there, also underlie the devotional aspect. So here we have a kind of blending of art and music and theology and liturgical practice in a completely new way. The Rosary Sonatas of Biber, a wonderful edition in which each of the sonatas is introduced by text from a Rosary prayer book contemporary with the piece of music. It's actually an English prayer book of the Rosary, and on the CD, Timothy West, the actor, is reading these wonderful meditations in front of the Rosary, and then each one of the meditations is then followed by a piece of music. So this is going to be a kind of wonderful way of linking the two things of the art and music together.
so that's the beginning of the, it's the Annunciation from the Rosary Sonatas. And Biber is using the theme of the Annunciation with that extraordinary sort of movement in the violin at the beginning, suggesting the rushing of the wings of the angel Gabriel as he comes in, and the arrival of the Holy Spirit. And so this is one of the very good paintings on the wall of the hall in Salzburg. And to finish with a great piece of art, which is Velázquez's Immaculate Conception. I would like to finish with the quotation that continues from Francesco Pacheco that we heard earlier on the subject of holy images. It would be hard to overstate the good that holy images do. They perfect our understanding, move our will, refresh our memory of divine things. They heighten our spirits and show to our eyes and hearts the heroic and magnanimous acts of patience, justice, of chastity, meekness, charity, and contempt for worldly things in such a way that they instantly cause us to seek virtue and to shun vice, and thus put us in the road that lead to blessedness. So this is a very high claim for art, and I think you'll agree that, considering the quality of the art that we've heard and seen this evening, this claim is justified.